What would you do if a giant snake mistook you for a threat? Would you fight with every ounce of strength you had, clawing and kicking to break free? Or would you try to reason with a creature that doesn't speak your language? A predator, driven by instinct alone? One zookeeper found himself trapped in a heart-pounding life-or-death situation, and what happened next will leave you utterly speechless. Jake had been a zookeeper for over a decade, a seasoned veteran who'd seen it all, or so he thought. He'd spent countless hours studying the world's most dangerous snakes, venomous cobras with their hypnotic hoods, massive anacondas that could swallow prey whole, and everything in between. At the zoo, he wasn't just good at his job. He was exceptional. His colleagues nicknamed him the Snake Whisperer because of his rare talent for connecting with even the most unpredictable reptiles. He could calm a rattlesnake with a steady gaze or coax a shy python out of hiding with a gentle touch. But no amount of experience, no textbook knowledge, no hours of training could have prepared him for the moment that would test everything. He thought he knew. It started like any other day at the zoo. The morning sun was just creeping over the horizon, casting long shadows across the enclosures as Jake began his rounds. He moved methodically, checking on the smaller snakes first. The rattlesnakes with their buzzing tails, the vipers with their sharp gleaming fangs, ensuring their habitats were secure and their water bowls full. Everything was routine, almost peaceful. Then came the main event, Titan, the zoo's crown jewel. Titan wasn't just any snake. This was a reticulated python, one of the largest in captivity, stretching over 20 feet long, with a body as thick as a tree trunk and a weight that rivaled most grown men. Its scales shimmered with a pattern of gold and brown, a living work of art. Jake had cared for Titan for years, feeding it, monitoring its health, and building what he believed was a bond of trust. He'd always felt a quiet pride walking into that enclosure, knowing he was one of the few who could handle such a magnificent beast. But today, something was different. As he pushed open the heavy door to Titan's enclosure, a strange stillness greeted him. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, like the calm before a storm. Jake adjusted his gear, his clipboard, his gloves, his radio, and stepped inside, his boots crunching softly against the substrate of wood chips and sand. He scanned the space, searching for Titan's familiar coils. The python liked to rest near the heat lamps or drape itself over the artificial branches, but today, it was nowhere obvious. Jake's brow furrowed. He took another step, his senses sharpening, and then he saw it, something that stopped him dead in his tracks. Nestled in the far corner of the enclosure, partially hidden beneath a tangled pile of leaves and branches, were several large glistening white eggs. Jake's breath caught in his throat. His mind raced as the pieces clicked into place. Titan wasn't just lounging today. Titan was guarding a clutch of eggs, its future offspring. Jake hadn't been told about this, hadn't checked the breeding logs in days. How had he missed it? His heart sank as the gravity of the situation hit him. He knew the science inside and out. In the wild, reticulated pythons were fiercely protective mothers. They didn't just guard their nests, they'd kill anything that dared come too close. He'd read the research papers, watched the grainy wildlife footage. Pythons could transform from calm to deadly in a heartbeat when their eggs were at stake. Their instincts kicked in, turning them into coiled weapons of muscle and scale. And right now, Jake was the intruder. He was standing less than 10 feet from the eggs, well within the danger zone of a snake that could crush a deer to death without breaking a sweat. He took a cautious step back, his movements slow and deliberate, trying to retreat without making a sound. But it was too late. Titan's massive head emerged from the shadows, rising like a specter. Its tongue flicked the air, tasting his scent, and those cold amber eyes locked onto him with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Jake's stomach twisted. He'd misjudged everything, his timing, his approach, his so-called bond with Titan. There was no time to think now, only to react. Before he could take another step, Titan struck. The snake moved like a bolt of lightning, its enormous body uncoiling in a blur of motion. Jake barely had time to raise his arms before Titan's thick, muscular coils slammed into him, wrapping around his torso with bone-crushing force. The impact knocked him off his feet, and he hit the ground hard, the air exploding from his lungs in a sharp gasp. Pain radiated through his ribs as the snake tightened its grip, squeezing relentlessly. His arms were pinned to his sides, useless against the python's strength. His vision blurred at the edges as panic clawed at his mind. He'd seen this before, pythons constricting prey like rabbits, goats, even a pig once during a feeding. Demonstration, but never like this. never with himself as the target. Each breath grew shallower, harder to draw. Titan's coils tightened with every exhale, a living vice that seemed to anticipate his every move. Jake's pulse thundered in, his ears drowning out the distant hum of the zoo, children laughing, birds calling, life going on as if he weren't fighting for his own. He could feel the snake's scales pressing into his skin, cold and smooth, a stark contrast to the heat of his own rising terror. His chest burned, his lungs screaming for oxygen he couldn't give them. In that moment, most people would have lost all hope. They'd thrash wildly, scream until their voice gave out, fight with whatever scraps of strength they had left. But Jake wasn't most people. He'd spent years learning how snakes operate, how they think, how they react. He knew that struggling would only seal his fate. Every twitch, every jerk would signal to Titan that he was prey, triggering the snake to squeeze harder until his ribs snapped and his lungs collapsed entirely. So, against every primal instinct screaming in his body, Jake made a choice. He stopped moving. His chest ached, his head swam, but he forced himself to stay still. With the last threads of air in his lungs, he rasped out a shaky whisper. "I mean no harm. I'm just here to take care of you." His voice was faint, trembling with effort, but he kept talking, repeating the words like a desperate prayer. "I'm not a threat, I'm your friend. I'm not here to hurt you or your eggs." He didn't know if Titan could hear him, let alone understand, but he had to try. Titan didn't let go right away. The snake's coils stayed tight, its head hovering inches from Jake's face. Those unblinking eyes bored into his, searching, judging. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Jake's vision darkened further, spots dancing across his eyes as his oxygen ran dangerously low. He wondered if this was the end, if he'd gambled on his knowledge and lost everything. But then, something changed. The pressure around his chest eased, just a fraction at first, so subtle he thought he'd imagined it. Then more noticeably, Titan's body relaxed, its coils loosening as if testing whether Jake would bolt or fight. He didn't. He stayed perfectly still, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps as the snake slowly unwound itself. With one final flicker of its tongue, Titan slithered back toward the eggs, curling protectively around them once more, its gaze still, fixed on Jake but no longer hostile. Jake stumbled backward, collapsing against the enclosure wall. His legs shook uncontrollably as he gulped down air, his hands trembling from the flood of adrenaline. His ribs ached. His shirt was soaked with sweat, but he was alive. That day, Jake walked away with more than just bruises and a wild story to tell. He gained a deeper respect for the creatures he'd dedicated his life to understanding. Titan wasn't evil or bloodthirsty. The snake hadn't attacked out of malice. It was acting on instinct, protecting what mattered most, its unborn young. In those terrifying moments, Jake saw fear reflected in Titan's actions, not just his own. He realized something profound. Survival isn't always about fighting back with fists or force. Sometimes it's about staying calm, reading the situation, and finding a way to connect, even with something that could end you in an instant. Jake didn't need to overpower Titan. He just needed to prove he wasn't the enemy. Looking back, he still replays the moment in his mind. What might have happened if he'd panicked or fought? Would Titan have crushed him without hesitation? Would he have made it out alive? He'll never know for certain, but he's thankful every day that he trusted his training and his gut. So what would you have done in Jake's shoes? Would you have stayed calm and tried to reason with a giant snake, whispering to it as your life hung in the balance? Or would you have fought tooth and nail, risking it all for a chance to break free? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you'd choose. And if you're hooked on incredible real-life stories like this one, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe for more. Until next time, stay curious and maybe keep a little extra distance from the snakes.